I never believed in miracles until 3:15 in the morning on a Tuesday changed everything I thought I knew about life and death. My name is David, and I've been an ICU nurse at Orlando Regional Medical Center for 12 years. 12 long years of watching families say goodbye, of seeing science push human bodies to their absolute limits, of trusting only in protocols, medications, and the cold reliability of machines that beep, buzz, and measure every heartbeat like mechanical guardians of life itself. Orlando's always been home to me. Born and raised here, I know every street corner, every sunset over Lake Eola, every humid summer that makes your scrubs stick to your skin before you even walk through the hospital doors. But more than anything, I know this ICU. I know the sound every ventilator makes, the rhythm of every monitor, the way fluorescent lights hum at 2 in the morning when the world outside is sleeping and we're fighting battles most people will never see. People always ask me how I do this job. How I walk into rooms where hope hangs by the thinnest thread. Where families clutch each other in hallways that smell like disinfectant and desperation. The truth is, I learned early to build walls. Emotional walls. Professional walls. Walls that keep me focused on what I can control. Following procedures. Administering medications on time, reading vital signs like a language only we understand. I thought those walls made me strong. I thought they made me a better nurse. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. It was November 15th, and I was pulling a double shift because Maria, one of our best nurses, had called in sick with the flu that was going around Orlando that month. The ICU was particularly heavy that night. 6 patients, all critical. All requiring the kind of attention that keeps your adrenaline pumping and your mind razor sharp for hours on end. But it was bed number 4 that would change my life forever. She was a 54-year-old woman named Catherine Morrison. Kath, her husband called her. She'd been admitted 3 days earlier with severe complications from what should have been a routine surgery. Sometimes the human body surprises us in the worst possible ways. Infections spread where they shouldn't. Organs fail when they're supposed to heal. And suddenly a simple procedure becomes a fight for survival. Catherine's case was textbook critical. Post-operative sepsis had ravaged her system. Her blood pressure was dangerously unstable, and her kidneys were showing signs of failure. Dr. Martinez, our attending physician, had been honest with the family from day one. This was going to be touch and go, and we needed to prepare for all possibilities. Her husband, Robert, hadn't left her side except when we physically made him step out for procedures. He was one of those quiet, steady men you meet sometimes in Orlando. Worked construction his whole life, hands weathered from decades of honest work, the kind of guy who fixes neighbors' fences without being asked, and shows up to every Little League game his grandkids play. Their daughter Sarah had flown in from Denver the moment she got the call. 28 years old, a teacher with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's stubborn determination not to give up. She'd been sleeping in the family waiting room, taking turns with her dad to sit beside Catherine's bed, talking to her even though the sedation kept her mother unresponsive. Before I continue, tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Stories like this one reach farther than you imagine. The family dynamic broke my heart in ways I usually didn't let myself feel. You see, in 12 years of ICU nursing, you learn to recognize the signs. You learn to read between the lines of what doctors say and what they don't say. You learn to see in families' eyes when they're preparing themselves for goodbye, even if they won't admit it out loud. And that Tuesday night, everything about Catherine Morrison's case was pointing in one direction. Her white blood cell count was through the roof, despite aggressive antibiotic therapy. Her organ function markers were declining steadily. The ventilator was doing most of her breathing, and even with maximum support, her oxygen saturation was barely holding steady. Dr. Martinez had increased her vasopressor drips twice in the last 6 hours just to maintain a blood pressure that would keep her vital organs perfused. In the medical world, we have phrases for situations like this. We talk about comfort measures, about making patients comfortable, about spending time with family. These are gentle ways of saying what everyone in the room knows but nobody wants to voice out loud. I'd been checking on Catherine every 30 minutes throughout my shift, adjusting IV drips, monitoring her ventilator settings, making sure her positioning was optimal to prevent pressure sores. Standard ICU care, the kind of meticulous attention to detail that becomes second nature after years of practice. But something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the way Robert held his wife's hand, speaking to her in whispers I couldn't quite hear. Maybe it was how Sarah brought in photos from home and taped them to the wall where Catherine could see them if she opened her eyes. Maybe it was the quiet dignity this family maintained even as their world was falling apart. At 2:45 in the morning, I was updating Catherine's chart when her monitor alarm started chirping. Blood pressure dropping, heart rate climbing. The numbers that had been barely stable for hours were now sliding in the wrong direction, fast. I increased her medication drips according to protocol and called Dr. Martinez. He arrived within minutes, took one look at the monitors, examined Catherine quickly, and gave me that look. The look that says we're running out of options. The look that means it's time to have a conversation with the family about what comes next. That's when everything I thought I knew about medicine, about science, about the predictable nature of human physiology, was about to be turned completely upside down. That's when everything I thought I knew about medicine, about science, about the predictable nature of human physiology, was about to be turned completely upside down. Dr. Martinez pulled me aside in the hallway outside Catherine's room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under his eyes, making him look older than his 43 years. He'd been working Orlando Regional's ICU for 8 years, and I'd never seen him look this tired, this defeated. "David," he said quietly, glancing toward the family waiting area where Robert and Sarah were trying to catch a few hours of sleep on those uncomfortable vinyl chairs that seemed designed to prevent rest. "We need to talk to the family. Her numbers are crashing, and we've exhausted our options." I nodded, feeling that familiar heaviness settle in my chest. The weight of knowing what comes next. In 12 years, I'd been part of these conversations more times than I cared to count. But it never got easier. Each time felt like a small defeat, a reminder of the limits of modern medicine. We walked back into Catherine's room together. The ventilator continued its rhythmic whooshing, pushing air in and out of lungs that were struggling to process oxygen. Her skin had taken on that grayish pallor I'd learned to recognize, the color of a body that's fighting a battle. It's slowly losing. "Look at these numbers," Dr. Martinez said, pointing to the monitor. "Blood pressure is 60/30, despite maximum vasopressor support. Her lactate levels are rising, which means her organs aren't getting enough oxygen. Kidney function is declining rapidly." He paused, running his hand through his graying hair. "David, in 20 years of practicing medicine, I've seen cases like this before. The human body can only take so much. We're at the point where we're causing more harm than good with our intervention." I checked Catherine's IV lines, making sure everything was flowing properly, buying myself a moment to process what he was really saying. Her central line was patent. Medications were infusing correctly. Ventilator settings were optimized. We were doing everything right by the book, but the book wasn't enough. "How long?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the way his shoulders sagged. "Hours, maybe less." At 3:15 in the morning, we gently woke Robert and Sarah. They followed us into Catherine's room with that horrible awareness that comes when medical staff gather around your loved one's bed. Sarah's hand found her father's arm, and I watched them both steel themselves for words no family ever wants to hear. Dr. Martinez spoke with the kind of compassionate directness that comes from years of practice. He explained Catherine's condition in terms they could understand, walking them through each failing system, each medication that was no longer working, each number on the monitor that told the same devastating story. "We've reached the limits of what medicine can do," he said softly. "Her body is shutting down despite our best efforts. I wish I had better news." Robert's weathered hands trembled as he reached for his wife's hand. Sarah pressed her face against her mother's shoulder, her quiet sobs the only sound besides the mechanical breathing of the ventilator. "How much time do we have?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not long, a few hours at most. We can make sure she's comfortable, make sure there's no pain. You should call anyone who needs to be here." The next hour was heartbreaking to witness. Sarah called her brother in California, waking him with news that would send him scrambling for the next flight to Orlando. Robert called Catherine's sister in Jacksonville, his voice breaking as he explained that she needed to come now if she wanted to say goodbye. I stayed busy, checking and rechecking everything, adjusting Catherine's position, monitoring her IV drips. It's what we do in these moments. We focus on the tasks, the medical procedures, Anything to maintain some sense of control when everything else is spinning out of our hands. At 4:30 in the morning, Catherine's blood pressure dropped to 50/25. Her heart rate climbed to 130, a desperate rhythm as her cardiovascular system fought to compensate for failing organs. The monitor alarms were going off constantly now, creating a symphony of electronic warnings that everyone in the room learned to ignore because there was nothing left to do about them. Dr. Martinez increased her pain medication and sedation. "She won't feel anything," he assured the family. "We'll make sure she's comfortable." Sarah held her mother's left hand while Robert held her right. They talked to her, sharing memories, telling her it was okay to let go, that they would be all right. The words every family says when they're trying to give permission for the impossible, trying to make peace with losing someone who defines their entire world. I dimmed the lights and turned off the non-essential monitor alarms, creating as much peace as possible in a room full of machines. This is part of what we do. We orchestrate these final moments, trying to bring dignity and calm to the most difficult experience a family can face. At 5:15 in the morning, Catherine's blood pressure dropped to 40/15. Her heart rate slowed to 90, then 80. The numbers on the monitor told a story that was reaching its inevitable conclusion. "This is it," Dr. Martinez whispered to me. "Her blood pressure won't sustain life much longer." I nodded, positioning myself where I could monitor everything while staying out of the family's way. In moments like these, families need space to say goodbye, to hold their loved one, to exist in that sacred space between life and whatever comes after. That's when the impossible happened. The monitor that had been showing a blood pressure of 35/10 suddenly jumped, 40/15, then 50/20. Catherine's heart rate, which had been fading toward 40 beats per minute, suddenly strengthened to 60, then 70. I stared at the screen, certain the machine was malfunctioning. But it wasn't just one machine. The pulse oximeter showed her oxygen saturation climbing from 78% to 85%, then 90%. The cardiac monitor displayed a heart rhythm that was becoming stronger, more regular, more alive. I grabbed my stethoscope and listened to Catherine's chest. Her lung sounds, which had been barely audible wet crackles just minutes before, were clearer. Her heart rate was steady at 75 beats per minute, not the desperate, irregular rhythm of a failing cardiovascular system, but the strong, consistent beat of a heart that was somehow finding its way back to life. "Dr. Martinez," I called quietly, trying not to alarm the family who were still saying their goodbyes, unaware that the numbers on the machines around them were defying every medical principle I'd learned in nursing school. He looked up from Catherine's chart, saw my expression, and immediately turned to the monitors. I watched his face go through the same sequence of emotions I was experiencing: confusion, disbelief, and then a kind of medical panic that comes when nothing makes sense anymore. "Check the connections," he whispered urgently. "Something's wrong with the equipment." I had already checked everything twice. Every wire, every lead, every IV line was exactly where it should be. The machines weren't malfunctioning. They were accurately reporting something that shouldn't have been possible. Catherine's blood pressure had climbed to 70/40. Not normal by any standard, but compatible with life. More than compatible. It was stable and holding steady. Her heart rate remained at a consistent 78 beats per minute. Dr. Martinez pulled out his own stethoscope and listened to her chest. His eyes met mine over Catherine's still form, and I saw in them the same bewilderment I felt. After 20 years of practicing medicine, he was hearing something that contradicted everything we'd just witnessed over the past hour. "Her breath sounds are improving," he said quietly. "This isn't possible, David. Patients don't reverse multi-organ failure in minutes, not without intervention, not ever." But it was happening right in front of us. At 5:45 in the morning, something even more impossible occurred. Catherine's eyelids fluttered. Just barely. Just enough to make me question whether I'd actually seen it. But then it happened again. "Robert," I said softly, not wanting to give false hope but unable to ignore what was happening. "Look at her face." Robert, who had been whispering something about their first anniversary 31 years ago, looked up at his wife's face, just as her eyes slowly opened. The sound that came from his throat was unlike anything I'd ever heard in an ICU. It was part sob, part gasp, part prayer made audible. Sarah's head snapped up from where it had been resting on her mother's shoulder. "Mom?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with disbelief and desperate hope. Catherine's eyes moved. Slowly, with tremendous effort, but they moved. They found Robert's face first, then Sarah's. Her lips, which had been gray and lifeless just minutes before, moved slightly as if she was trying to speak around the ventilator tube. Dr. Martinez was frantically checking everything: her pupils' response to light, her reflexes, her ability to follow simple commands. Each test revealed the same impossible truth. Catherine Morrison was not dying anymore. Somehow, against all medical logic, her body was fighting its way back from the brink. "I need to call the lab," Dr. Martinez said, his voice tight with professional confusion. "I need new blood work, new cultures, new everything. This doesn't happen. Bodies in multi-organ failure don't just recover." But as he spoke, Catherine's oxygen saturation climbed to 94%. Her blood pressure stabilized at 80/50. Her heart rhythm was strong and regular. The lactate levels that had been climbing steadily for hours would later show a dramatic improvement that would leave our entire medical team searching for explanations that didn't exist. I had been a nurse for 12 years. I had seen recoveries that surprised doctors, patients who fought longer than anyone expected, medications that worked better than predicted. But I had never seen anything like this. I had never witnessed a human body reverse course from active dying to stable condition in the span of 30 minutes with no medical intervention to explain it. Sarah was crying now, but they weren't the tears of grief she'd been shedding an hour earlier. These were tears of confusion, of hope, of joy mixed with disbelief. Robert kept saying, "Kath, can you hear me?" over and over, as if the repetition might help him believe what his eyes were telling him. At 6:15 in the morning, Dr. Martinez made the decision to attempt weaning Catherine from the ventilator. Her blood gases supported spontaneous breathing, her oxygen levels were stable, and she was showing clear signs of consciousness. It was a decision that would have been unthinkable just 2 hours earlier. The respiratory therapist Maria Santos had been called in early for what we thought would be end-of-life care. Instead, she found herself preparing to remove life support from a patient who was inexplicably recovering. "In 15 years, Maria whispered to me as she prepared the equipment, "I've never seen anything like this. Her lung compliance is improving by the minute. It's like her body just decided to live." As we carefully removed Catherine's ventilator tube, the entire room held its breath. This is always a critical moment, the transition from mechanical breathing to the patient's own respiratory effort. For someone who had been as critically ill as Catherine, it should have been impossible. But her first independent breath was strong. Her second was even stronger. "Robert," Catherine whispered, her voice hoarse from the tube, but unmistakably clear. "Sarah." The sound of her voice, weak but present, tired but alive, filled that ICU room with an energy I'd never experienced in 12 years of nursing. It wasn't just relief or joy. It was something bigger. Something that made every person in that room question everything they thought they understood about life and death and the space between them. Dr. Martinez stepped back from Catherine's bed and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. It was the face of a man whose entire understanding of medicine had just been challenged by something that defied explanation. "David," he said quietly, "I need to document this, but I don't know how." How do you write in a medical chart that a patient recovered from multi-organ failure with no intervention? How do you explain what we just witnessed? That's when I realized that everything I thought I knew about my job, about science, about the predictable nature of human biology, had just changed forever. That's when I realized that everything I thought I knew about my job, about science, about the predictable nature of human biology, had just changed forever. I stepped outside Catherine's room and found myself leaning against the hallway wall, my hands shaking in a way they hadn't since my first year of nursing. 12 years of ICU experience, thousands of patients, countless medical emergencies, and nothing had prepared me for what I'd just witnessed. The logical part of my mind was scrambling for explanations. Maybe the lab results were wrong. Maybe the initial diagnosis was incorrect. Maybe we'd missed something obvious, some medication interaction or underlying condition that could explain Catherine's sudden recovery. But I knew better. I'd been monitoring her every vital sign, every breath, every heartbeat for hours. I'd watched her body systematically shut down despite our best interventions. I'd seen the look in Dr. Martinez's eyes when he told the family there was nothing more we could do. That wasn't medical uncertainty. That was medical certainty based on 20 years of experience. And yet, Catherine Morrison was alive. Not just alive, but improving by the hour. At 7:30 in the morning, the day shift arrived to find our ICU in a state of controlled chaos. Word had spread quickly among the medical staff. Nurses, respiratory therapists, and residents were finding excuses to walk past Catherine's room, stealing glances at the patient who had somehow defied every medical principle they'd learned in school. Dr. Sarah Chen, our ICU director, arrived an hour early after Dr. Martinez called her at home. She was a woman who had seen everything in 30 years of critical care medicine: medical miracles, unexpected recoveries, patients who survived against impossible odds. But even she stood at Catherine's bedside with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Walk me through it again," she said to Dr. Martinez as I adjusted Catherine's IV medications. From the beginning. Dr. Martinez recounted the night's events in precise medical terms. Multi-organ failure, septic shock, maximum vasopressor support, declining kidney function, preparation for end-of-life care. Then the inexplicable reversal: vital signs stabilizing, organ function improving, spontaneous recovery with no medical intervention. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Dr. Martinez asked. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying Catherine's chart, and then looking at her patient, who was now sitting up slightly in bed, holding Robert's hand and speaking in whispered conversations with her daughter. "No," she said finally. "In 30 years, I've never seen anything like this." Meanwhile, Catherine's recovery continued to defy explanation. Her latest blood work showed kidney function returning toward normal levels. Her white blood cell count was dropping, indicating that her body was winning the fight against infection. Her chest X-rays showed clearing of the fluid that had been threatening her lung function just hours earlier. But it wasn't just the medical improvements that shook me to my core. It was watching the transformation in that room. Robert had gone from preparing to say goodbye to his wife of 31 years to cautiously allowing himself to hope that she might come home. Sarah had gone from planning her mother's funeral to calling her brother in California with news that seemed too good to be true. The atmosphere in the ICU had changed too. Our unit, which deals with life and death every single day, had an energy I'd never experienced. Staff members who had worked there for decades were talking in hushed tones about the patient in room 4. Not because her condition was deteriorating, but because her condition was impossible. At 9:15 in the morning, Catherine asked for water. It was such a simple request, the kind of thing we hear dozens of times every shift. But coming from a patient who had been actively dying 6 hours earlier, it felt miraculous. I helped her take small sips through a straw, watching her face as she tasted water for the first time in days. Her color had returned. Not the gray pallor of someone whose organs were failing, but the normal pink of healthy circulation. Her eyes were alert and focused, tracking movement around the room and engaging in conversation with her family. "Nurse David," she said, her voice still hoarse but gaining strength. "My family tells me you took care of me all night. Thank you." I didn't know how to respond. How do you explain to a patient that you watched her die and then watched her come back to life? How do you tell someone that their recovery has challenged everything you believed about medicine and science and the nature of life itself? "You're welcome, Mrs. Morrison," I said. "I'm just glad you're feeling better." But better felt like an inadequate word for what had happened. This wasn't a gradual improvement or a typical recovery. This was a complete reversal of multiple organ failure that occurred in a time span that defied medical explanation. Dr. Martinez spent the morning consulting with specialists, reviewing Catherine's case with colleagues at other hospitals, searching medical literature for similar documented cases. He found nothing. No published studies, no case reports, no medical precedent for what we had witnessed. "I've been thinking about this all morning," he told me during a quiet moment. "How do I write this up? How do I document a recovery that shouldn't be possible? The medical community relies on evidence-based medicine, on cases that can be replicated and explained. This case exists outside of everything we understand. By 10:30 in the morning, Catherine was eating ice chips and asking about going home. Her vital signs were stable without any vasopressor support. Her oxygen levels were normal on room air. Her kidney function continued to improve with each lab draw. The infectious disease specialist who had been consulting on her case arrived to find a patient who no longer needed his expertise. The nephrologist who had been preparing for possible dialysis found kidney function that was rapidly returning to normal ranges. The pulmonologist who had been concerned about her respiratory failure found clear lung fields and excellent oxygenation. Each specialist left Catherine's room with the same expression of medical bewilderment that I'd been carrying all morning. But it was the reaction of Catherine's family that affected me most deeply. I watched Robert hold his wife's hand with a gentleness that spoke of 31 years of marriage and the miracle of getting more time together. I saw Sarah showing her mother pictures on her phone. Grandchildren Catherine thought she might never see again. Family events she thought she would miss. I prayed all night, Robert told me quietly while Catherine was napping. I know that might sound foolish to someone in the medical field, but I prayed harder than I've ever prayed in my life. I didn't tell him it sounded foolish. Because standing in that room, watching his wife recover from something that should have been impossible, I wasn't sure what sounded foolish anymore. At noon, Dr. Chen made a decision that would have been unthinkable 12 hours earlier. She moved Catherine from the ICU to a regular medical floor. Her condition was stable enough that she no longer needed critical care monitoring. As I helped transfer Catherine to her new room, she squeezed my hand and said something I'll never forget. I don't remember much about last night, but I remember feeling like I wasn't alone. Even in the darkest moment, I felt surrounded by love. Walking back to the ICU after that transfer, I realized that my understanding of my profession had been fundamentally altered. For 12 years, I had believed that medicine was about protocols and procedures, medications and machines, scientific knowledge applied to human physiology. But Catherine Morrison had shown me something different. She had shown me that sometimes, in the space between what we can explain and what we can witness, something extraordinary happens. Something that belongs not only to science, but to life and faith. Something that belongs not only to science, but to life and faith. The rest of my shift that Tuesday felt surreal. I moved through my usual routines, checking on other patients, administering medications, updating charts. But my mind kept returning to Catherine Morrison's room. Even though she was no longer under my care, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd witnessed. During my break, I found myself sitting in the hospital cafeteria at 2:15 in the afternoon, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. Other staff members were talking about their usual concerns, shift changes, weekend plans, the latest hospital policy updates. Normal conversations about normal things. But I felt like I was living in two different worlds now. The predictable world of medical protocols that I'd known for 12 years, and this new world where impossible things could happen in the space between heartbeats. Dr. Martinez found me there, looking as unsettled as I felt. He sat down across from me without saying anything for several minutes, just stirring his coffee and staring out the window at the Orlando skyline. I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, he finally said. I've delivered thousands of diagnoses, seen countless recoveries, witnessed more deaths than I care to count. I thought I understood the boundaries of what was possible. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. Catherine Morrison just redrew those boundaries, and I don't know what to do with that information. I knew exactly what he meant. In nursing school, they teach you about evidence-based practice, about the importance of protocols and procedures, about trusting in measurable, repeatable, scientifically validated interventions. They don't teach you what to do when all of that fails to explain what you've just witnessed. Have you called your wife yet? I asked. Told her about tonight? Dr. Martinez nodded. I tried to explain it to her, but the words sounded crazy, even as I was saying them. Honey, I watched a patient die and then come back to life with no medical explanation. How do you share something like that with someone who wasn't there? That's when I realized something that would stay with me for years to come. Some experiences exist outside the boundaries of normal human communication. Some moments are so far beyond our usual understanding that they can only be truly comprehended by those who witness them firsthand. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I decided to check on Catherine one more time before my shift ended. I knew she was no longer my patient, but I needed to see her again, to confirm that what I remembered had actually happened. I found her sitting up in her regular hospital bed, eating real food. Not the ice chips from that morning, but actual solid food. Her color was completely normal now, her breathing unlabored, her movements natural and coordinated. If I hadn't known her medical history, I would have assumed she was a patient recovering from minor surgery, not someone who had been in multi-organ failure less than 24 hours earlier. Robert was there, of course, looking like a man who had been given the most precious gift imaginable: more time with his wife. Sarah had driven back to the airport to pick up her brother, whose emergency flight from California had landed an hour earlier. "Nurse David!" Catherine called out when she saw me in the doorway. "Come in, please." I walked to her bedside, still somewhat in disbelief that this vibrant, alert woman was the same person whose life I'd watched slip away in the early hours of the morning. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, reaching for my hand. "Robert told me how you stayed with me all night, how you took care of me when things looked impossible." "Mrs. Morrison," I said, "I have to tell you, in 12 years of nursing, I've never seen anything like what happened to you. Your recovery was extraordinary." She smiled, and there was something in her eyes that I hadn't expected, a kind of peaceful knowing, as if she understood something about her experience that the rest of us were still trying to grasp. "I know this might sound strange," she said quietly, "but I remember some of it. Not the medical details, but I remember feeling like I was at a crossroads, like I had a choice to make." Robert squeezed her other hand. "Kath, you don't have to." "No, it's okay," she continued. "I remember thinking about our grandchildren, about Sarah's wedding next year, about all the mornings I still wanted to wake up next to you." She looked at her husband with 31 years of love in her eyes. "And I remember deciding that I wasn't ready to leave yet." I don't know what I expected her to say, but it wasn't that. In all my years of critical care nursing, I'd never had a patient describe their near-death experience in terms of making a conscious choice to return. "The doctors say they can't explain what happened. They've run every test, consulted with specialists, reviewed my case multiple times, but they can't find a medical reason for my recovery." She paused, looking directly at me. "Sometimes the most important things can't be measured by machines or explained by textbooks. Sometimes they just are." At 6:30 at night, as I was finally getting ready to leave the hospital after my extended shift, I ran into Maria Santos, the respiratory therapist who had helped remove Catherine's ventilator that morning. "David," she called out as I was walking to the parking garage, "I've been thinking about Mrs. Morrison all day." We stood there in the humid Orlando evening, two medical professionals trying to process an experience that challenged everything we thought we understood about our work. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Maria said. "I've seen patients surprise us. I've seen recoveries that exceeded expectations. But I've never seen anything like what happened this morning. The speed of her improvement, the completeness of her recovery. It defies everything I learned in respiratory therapy school." "What do you think happened?" I asked. Maria was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the darkening sky above Orlando. "I think," she said finally, "that we witnessed something that medicine doesn't have words for yet. Maybe something that medicine will never have words for." As I drove home through the familiar streets of Orlando, past the lake where I used to fish as a kid, past the neighborhood where I grew up, I realized that Catherine Morrison had given me something unexpected. She had shown me that after 12 years of believing I understood the limits and possibilities of human life, there was still room for wonder. The walls I'd built to protect myself from the emotional weight of my job, those professional barriers that kept me focused on protocols and procedures, had been irreversibly changed. Not broken, but expanded, made more flexible, more open to possibilities I hadn't considered before. That night, I called my own family and told them I loved them. Not because Catherine's experience had made me fear death, but because it had reminded me how precious and mysterious life really is. That night, I called my own family and told them I loved them. Not because Catherine's experience had made me fear death, but because it had reminded me how precious and mysterious life really is. 3 months later, Catherine Morrison returned to Orlando Regional Medical Center. Not as a patient, but as a visitor. She brought homemade cookies for the ICU staff and photos from her daughter Sarah's wedding. The wedding she almost missed, the celebration she thought she'd never see. I was working the day shift when she arrived, and seeing her walk through those ICU doors on her own 2 feet, laughing with her husband, carrying flowers for the nurses' station, felt like witnessing the impossible all over again. "Nurse David!" she called out, and her voice was strong and clear, nothing like the hoarse whisper I'd heard when she first spoke after being removed from the ventilator. She hugged me, something that patients don't often do, and whispered, "Thank you for being there during the darkest hour. Thank you for not giving up, even when everything looked hopeless." But that's the thing. I had given up. Medically speaking, we all had. We'd reached the limits of what modern medicine could offer, and we were prepared to let nature take its course. What brought Catherine back wasn't anything we did in that ICU. It was something else entirely. Dr. Martinez joined us, and I watched him examine Catherine with the same sense of wonder he'd carried for months. Her recovery had become legendary in our hospital. Medical students rotated through our ICU specifically to hear about the case that couldn't be explained. Visiting physicians from other hospitals asked to review her charts. Medical journals had requested detailed case studies. "How do you feel?" Dr. Martinez asked her, still somewhat incredulous that he was having this conversation with someone who had been actively dying under his care just 3 months earlier. "I feel grateful," Catherine replied. "Every single day I wake up grateful. Grateful for Robert's coffee that's too strong. Grateful for Sarah's phone calls that are too long. Grateful for mundane Tuesday afternoons and ordinary Sunday mornings. I feel grateful for things I used to take for granted." She paused, looking around the ICU that had been the site of her impossible recovery. "But mostly, I feel grateful that I got to experience something that reminded me how mysterious and beautiful life really is." After Catherine and Robert left that day, I found myself thinking about how their story had changed not just me, but our entire medical team. Dr. Martinez had started incorporating more time for family conversation into his patient consultations. Maria Santos had begun talking to unconscious patients during procedures, just in case they could hear her. Even Dr. Chen, our pragmatic ICU director, had softened her approach to discussing prognoses with families. Catherine Morrison had taught us that medicine is both an art and a science, and that sometimes the most important healing happens in spaces that textbooks can't measure or explain. 6 months after Catherine's recovery, I was working another night shift when we admitted a young father who had been in a severe car accident. 29 years old, 2 small children, a wife who was 7 months pregnant. His injuries were extensive, his prognosis was poor, and his family was facing the same impossible situation that Robert and Sarah had faced that Tuesday morning in November. As I monitored his vital signs throughout the night, adjusting medications and checking his responses, I found myself doing something I'd never done before in 12 years of nursing. I started talking to him. "Your wife is here," I told his unconscious form. "She's in the waiting room with your parents. Your little girl drew you a picture. It's taped to your wall right where you can see it when you wake up." I told him about Catherine Morrison, about the Tuesday morning when impossible became possible, about the choice she remembered making at the crossroads between life and death. "I don't know if you can hear me," I said quietly, checking his IV lines and adjusting his ventilator settings. "But if you can, I want you to know that sometimes patients surprise us. Sometimes people come back from places we didn't think they could return from." He didn't recover the way Catherine did. His healing was slower, more conventional, explainable by medical intervention and the gradual repair of traumatic injuries. But he did recover. 6 weeks later, he walked out of the hospital holding his newborn son, and his wife sent me a photo of their family together, whole, healthy, grateful. Maybe his recovery had nothing to do with Catherine's story. Maybe it would have happened exactly the same way regardless of the words I spoke during those long night hours. But maybe, just maybe, there's something to be said for the power of believing that impossible things can happen. A year after Catherine Morrison changed my understanding of medicine and life, I was promoted to charge nurse of the ICU. In my new role, I started doing something that my predecessor had never done. During our monthly staff meetings, I began setting aside time for what I called unexplained outcomes, cases that challenged our medical understanding, recoveries that defied explanation, moments when our patients showed us that human resilience extends beyond what we can predict or measure. Not every story was as dramatic as Catherine's, but there were others. The elderly man who recovered from a massive stroke that should have left him completely incapacitated. The young woman who survived a heart attack that should have been fatal. The child who bounced back from an illness that had our pediatric specialists preparing the worst-case scenarios. These stories didn't make medical headlines. They didn't revolutionize treatment protocols or change standard procedures, but they did something more important. They reminded our medical team that we are privileged to work in a profession where miracles, however rare, are always possible. Catherine Morrison taught me that being a good nurse isn't just about following protocols and administering medications correctly. It's about remaining open to wonder, maintaining hope even in the darkest hours, and never underestimating the mysterious resilience of the human spirit. Today, as I walk through the halls of Orlando Regional Medical Center, I carry with me the lesson that Catherine gave me on that impossible Tuesday. Science and medicine are powerful tools for healing, but they don't hold all the answers. Sometimes, in the space between what we can explain and what we can witness, extraordinary things happen. Things that belong not only to science, but to life and faith. If this story touched you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not alone in believing that impossible things can happen. Every comment, every shared experience, every story of hope you share in the comments below reminds us all that we live in a world where miracles, however rare, however unexplainable, are always possible. From Orlando to wherever you are watching tonight, remember this. The most important things in life can't always be measured by machines or explained by textbooks. Sometimes, they just are. And sometimes, that's enough.